So the tribulation that Jesus prophesied is already fulfilled. It was fulfilled within one generation, like he said it would be. It is well in our past. And we are now living in the long period of time in which we are supposed to be pursuing a relationship with God, discovering and developing and deploying our God-given gifts and abilities, and using them primarily to be a blessing to the least of these, to those who are suffering and struggling, so that we can make the world a better place in some way as we await the return of Christ. I've said that in the last 2 or 3 videos, and I noticed on YouTube that on one video in particular, like 100 people or more came on to tell me that I was a false teacher and that the tribulation had not happened yet. And here is the proof that it's not happened yet. And then they posted a whole bunch of verses, none of which had anything to do with the timing of the tribulation. In fact, all the verses, or most of the verses that were quoted, had to do with the final return of Christ and the new creation and what happens when Christ returns. So that made me think, why are all these people quoting verses about the final return of Christ and what happens thereafter, and claiming that that's proof that the tribulation has not yet happened, when those verses are not about the tribulation? Well, let me help you out here. If you are used to hearing something over and over and over again, to such an extent that now you associate that thing with something else, because every time you've heard about that thing, it has always been associated with this other thing, then it's very difficult for you when you hear somebody talking about those two separate things as the separate things that they are. It's hard for you to separate them because you've always heard them connected together. It would be like, imagine you were brought up in a home where at lunchtime you were always given a tuna sandwich. So whenever your mother said, it's lunchtime, you knew that meant a tuna sandwich. Or if she said, your tuna sandwich is ready, you knew that meant it was lunchtime. Then imagine that as you grow up and leave home, you meet other people who do not have tuna sandwiches at lunchtime and don't associate the two things. And then they happen to say to you, oh, I stopped off yesterday at Subway and I got myself a tuna sandwich. And in your mind, you presumed it was lunchtime. And then later on, you bumped into another friend who told you, oh yeah, me and that friend that you were just with, yeah, we had a tuna sandwich yesterday at 4 p.m. And you said to them, no, you didn't. You had a tuna sandwich at noon or at lunchtime. And they said, no, I had it at 4 p.m. We were there at 4 p.m. No, you're lying. They told me that they had a tuna sandwich and you have tuna sandwiches at lunchtime, at noon. Well, the other person would be totally confused. They don't understand that you're connecting tuna sandwiches and lunchtime because that's all you've ever heard. Every time you've heard about lunch, it's been about a tuna sandwich. Every time you've heard about a tuna sandwich, it's been about lunch. But to other people, they know that those two things are separate. They could be connected, but they're not necessarily connected. Likewise, what I realized as I was looking through these comments was that so many Christians have been so trained that the Great Tribulation and the second coming, the final return of Christ, are so connected that they're practically the same thing. So when somebody says the tribulation's past, then they'll say things like, well, what, are we living in a new heaven and new earth? Obviously, we're not living in, obviously the final judgment hasn't happened yet. So obviously the tribulation hasn't happened. Every eye has not seen Jesus return. So obviously the tribulation hasn't happened. And I think, A tuna sandwich has got nothing to do with lunchtime. The final return of Christ has got nothing to do with the tribulation. They're two separate things, spoken about differently. In fact, in Matthew 24, Jesus, when speaking about the Great Tribulation, constantly refers to it as those days. And in those days, this will happen. And in those days, that will happen. And unless those days were cut short, no one would have been saved from it. And then when he talks about his final return, he says, but in that day and hour, no one knows when that will happen. Those days that would be fulfilled in one generation was the Great Tribulation. That day and hour that no one knows is the final return of Christ. They are two different things. The fact that you are used to hearing about them together does not mean that they belong together. And therefore, the fact that you can quote verses that talk about the final return of Christ and what happens then and thereafter has got nothing to do with the timing of the tribulation. Jesus was clear that the timing of the tribulation would be within a generation. This generation shall not pass away before all these things are fulfilled. And even at the end of Matthew 23, he said that the blood of all the prophets will be held to the account of this generation. He was speaking to the generation that then existed. That's why he said to his disciples, when you see this happen, and when you see that happen, and they will take you before synagogues, and they'll put you on trial, because he was speaking to things that they would see, things within that generation. So, if you react to people saying that the tribulation has already been fulfilled, it's behind us, it was the Jewish-Roman War in AD 66 to AD 70, when everything that Jesus predicted actually happened. And if you react to that and say, no, of course it's not happened yet, because every eye hasn't seen Jesus return, and there's not been the final judgment, and we don't yet have a new heaven and new earth. That's the final return of Christ you're speaking about, not the tribulation. They're two different things. Have a little study of it.